Jesus. That was a good one. I think we might have gone a bit long though.
Hello and welcome to On the Same Page, a podcast in which two mates separated by oceans and hemispheres talk about books and catch each other up on life between the lines. Unfortunately, we can't get together in person, but through this podcast we hope to get on the same page.
Welcome to On the Same Page. My name is Blake and I am, as always, with my trusty co-host, Seamus. How are you, Shame?
Very well indeed. We are your entertainment this evening. How are you going, Blake?
This morning, or
this morning for you, of course.
It's the glory of podcasts. You can listen to it whenever. Actually, when do you usually listen to podcasts? Let's start with that. Are you a big podcast listener?
I am. Probably driving to and from work or when I'm out walking. So daytime, I guess. Probably not a nighttime thing. More reading at night, I think. What about you?
Yeah, I guess a bit of both. I more go in big phases of I'm either always listening to podcasts or always listening to audiobooks. And
what are you in right now?
Audiobooks.
Nice.
I just finished this morning the audiobook of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Have you read that one or know that one?
No, I haven't. No, I don't even know it. Well, Treasure Island.
Gothic London, so you'd love it.
Oh, nice, yes. I would.
I mean, it's a classic. I think like it's in the language as Jekyll and Hyde, someone who has dual personalities. And that, I mean, it's kind of so in the language that the story's kind of wrecked, like you kind of know what to happen. But it's a novella, it's not long.
Nice.
And it...
Is it free on Audible?
It is. That's why I picked it up.
Because there's so much free stuff, yeah.
I know, there's so much free stuff now. It's so annoying because I spent so many credits in the years paying this stuff.
So many of these books, I'm just like, you bastards.
Yeah, it's now on the Plus catalogue. I mean, not hating Audible. I love you, Audible. I mean,
so much love.
Pay your workers more, but whatever. But don't stop doing what you're doing, because I love your audiobook.
Just pay them more money.
Yeah, and give them toilet breaks and shit. But and it was a good recording. Really very much in the vein of Frankenstein and stuff like that. Didn't have much of the extra detail of Dracula or anything like that. Right. But just a good strong narration, good strong listen. And Robert Louis Stevenson, really considering the psychology of good and evil and duality of personality and all these good things that the kind of people were starting to think about in the 19th century. And it was good, but very much in one of those phases where I listen to a lot of audiobooks. And I always listen to audiobooks in the morning because I kind of get up and spend a half an hour going to the toilet, brushing my teeth, making a coffee, having a slice of toast, preparing. Gross. You poop? That's gross. Before I start writing and stuff. And so I like to have something to lead me into writing. If I'm listening to a podcast and then they talk about something and then they lead, and I was like, I'll just Wikipedia that or something like that. And then I'm already distracted for an hour goes past. I'd rather just kind of listen to a long book that I'm listening to, which kind of just feeds me into writing myself. Which generally one of my kind of New Year's resolutions was to finish Proust's Remembrance of Times Past. I read the first one and now I'm listening to an audiobook of the second one in a budding grove. And so maybe over the course of this year, in like 20 to 30 minute morning segments, I'll read the whole fucking 7 volumes. Yeah. But that's good. It leads well into, it's a big influence on the writing I'm doing anyway, so it's good. But big vibes. Sometimes podcasts, sometimes not. But that leads me on to the inner shelf. And what was your inner shelf this week?
Well, this week I went to the cinema and I saw the new film, The Tragedy of Macbeth.
Oh, shit. With Denzel?
Yeah, with Denzel.
Oh, my God,
Washington.
how was it?
It was it was a lot of fun actually. Done by Joel Cohen, one of the Cohen brothers.
Man.
So
Yeah,
straight away a big fan, but done in this very artistic way that it's in black and white. His use of shadows is his use of light and dark is amazing. But I think if you watch the trailer, you'll understand what I mean when I say it's very sparsely populated. And it was a lot of fun, but the timing in it is, I got the sense it's almost, there's a bit of inspiration from perhaps Wes Anderson in his timing of the quirkiness when someone's walking in a scene of Wes Anderson. They like walk in one door and then suddenly they're at the top of the stairs straight away kind of thing and zip past. It was a lot of fun. I'd recommend it. It was rated R, and I don't know why it was rated R, but maybe MA, but fantastic play by Shakespeare, Macbeth, of course, and then wonderfully done. I mean,
wow. And Frances McDormand as Lady Macbeth, that seemed to me amazing. I was excited to see that.
Yeah, she's
I didn't
really
know
good.
it was coming out in cinemas. I had seen that it was coming on Apple TV, and I was thinking of getting a subscription just for that.
Yeah, I was going to get it, and then I saw it. It was at the Orpheum for a limited release, so I thought,
mate,
support the Orpheum.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I love those two actors as well. So I love Macbeth is a big. I was actually thinking last week on the Memoirs episode, I talked about Hitch 22, and one of something he talks about in that memoir is a game that, a very nerdy literary game that himself and Martin Amis and Ian McEwan and Salman Rushdie and stuff all play, or at least played a few times, was they were like sitting around and drinking and they used to do all these games about like retitling famous works of literature and making them slightly less good. So instead of For Whom the Bell Tolls, it's For Whom the Bell Rings, or something like that. Taking the edge off it.
Yeah.
And they had another name which started, I think, Ian McEwan or someone was on a plane and then arrived at London and went straight to hang out with the group. And they had been reading or found on the plane a copy of a Robert Ludlum novel. Have you ever read any of the Bourne Identity
No, I haven't.
novels? I was obsessed with them growing up. They're just, secret agent books.
Yeah.
But they've all got these titles, as you know from the films, like the Bourne Ultimatum, the Bourne Supremacy, the Bourne. Got all these long names like that. And they used to do... and apparently once they were playing this game of like renaming Shakespeare plays as if Robert Ludlum had given them the title, and they're trying to come up with them, and Salman Rushdie walks in the room and they go, Salman, and they tell him what they're doing, and he's like, all right, give me one. And so they say Hamlet, and he thinks for a second, and he says the Elsinore Vacillation, and they're like, oh shit, that's good. But then one of my favorites is the Macbeth, and they go, okay, Macbeth. And he thinks for a second, and he goes, the Dunsinane Reforestation. Just so good. Those moving trees. God damn.
Yeah.
Very excited to see that. It's interesting they say it's a bit quirky, so they try and make it they put some comedy.
Not quirky, but just, I mean, it's obviously a play where there's a war taking place, but in the movie and in the play, there's only a certain number of characters speaking. So in the movie, they sort of address that, and they just have these scenes that should be vastly populated with thousands of warriors and stuff. And sometimes there's only like 10 people, and often in scenes, there's only 1 or 2 people or 3 people. It's very, very sparsely populated.
Yeah.
Which I think is... it's a fun thing to try, and I mean there's thousands of Shakespeare sort of remakes, and a lot of them try to do the same thing. So
I think a lot of them do try and maintain a bit of that stage sensibility where you can only have a small amount of cast. If you've seen Chimes at Midnight, which was Orson Welles' Henry IV, amazing, and he plays Falstaff in that. It's one of the fucking greatest films ever made. And a similar thing, you get that there's only a few characters, and oh wow, there's a whole, an army arrives and it's like 6 dudes. But like a stage, you have to let your imagination do a bit of the work, which is
absolutely
something which is why theater is a good in between for novels and films. Like, you actually have to do a bit of the work. With a film, you kind of have to do nothing. It does everything for you. If you watch Lord of the Rings, you don't have to do anything.
Just sit back and enjoy.
Exactly. But I think with especially something of the level of Macbeth, it's like if you have to do something, it does bring you in and actually makes you partake, and especially if you've got to pay attention to the language, like a modern audience
absolutely
have to do a lot more with Shakespeare than an Elizabethan audience would have maybe understood it a bit easier. But exciting. That's a good one.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
How was your week in terms of inner shelf moments? Well,
as you know, I mean, we talked about this briefly off air. There has been a good and a somewhat anticlimactic but good progress on my visit to Australia, which has been long pending, where my partner Smira got a visa and we are finally heading down under. I don't know when. And it's not going to be I mean, it's not don't worry, it's not a Novak Djokovic situation. We are fully vaccinated and we hope they don't put us in prison. But I don't know when, but it is approved, visa approved. We are allowed to visit, which has been...
And soon we will be recording podcasts in the same room.
Live and in person in the next month or two. So that is very exciting. We'll probably have to change the intro song because it will no longer apply.
For those episodes that it doesn't apply.
Interim. Yeah. But that's been a good, nice bit of a breath of fresh air life, somewhat promising event.
And a good time of year to come as well. February, perhaps March, still hot enough to go to the beach. Hopefully sunny.
And just breaking up this horrendous northern winter, which drags on. February's the worst.
Been raining non-stop here recently, and the humidity must be, I'm just checking it now, it's still 93%, and it's nearly 9:30 at night. Gorgeous.
I would love to be sweating like a bitch right now.
God. No.
But well, that leads us into travel. So today we are talking about travel writing. And so how did you approach today's topic? Do you like reading travel writing? Have you kind of approached it in just books in which travel occurs? I mean, you're a great Lord of the Rings fan. That whole series is about just some dudes walking, isn't it?
About a journey, So I've got one that I know you could have possibly picked for yours, and it is a travel writer. And the other two, I've gone sort of a more fun option. One's definitely much more fun than the other, and the other, it does relate to traveling and give you some philosophical insights into what travel can bring to you, but they're not done by travel writers per se. So that's how I sort of went with it. I tried to have a bit of fun with it. How about you?
I think I probably stuck to, maybe one's a bit eccentric, but otherwise I kind of stuck to what is probably considered in a genre sense travel writing, or if you look at a writer's oeuvre, you'll have their fiction, and then non-fiction it will be broken down into maybe critical works and then travel writing and etc. So this was definitely... And, I guess travel writing is really kind of backing onto reportage and journalism and fields like that. And that was really my entry into literature. So I'm very fond of this style of writing. And when I was very young, I think Baudelaire coined the term horror of home as a kind of disease that he had, and that he wanted to travel ASAP. And I definitely did as well, and started traveling very young. And because you're traveling, people are talking about traveling, and it becomes an interest of yours, obviously. And so in hostels and stuff, you come across traveling books and journalism and reportage, and I've always kind of had that feeling. I had to look up this quote because I knew I'd forget it, but it's again from Baudelaire, where he said, "It always seems to me that I'll be well where I am not, and this question of moving is one that I'm forever entertaining with my soul." He always has that idea of, the next place I'm going to be is, going to be the place where I'll be good. I'll be happy, or I'll be, I just have to keep
or something.
Yeah, just have to keep moving. I kind of really adore travel writing, and as I was kind of deciding, I think 2 came to me straight away, and I was kind of thinking about, just the travel writers that I've read, and I kind of realized that there's quite a dearth, or at least in my mind, there was a dearth of female travel writers, and of course, like women's writing in general, there wasn't much opportunity for it until about, even 150 years ago.
Yeah.
But, I'd read Jan Morris, who was a kind of great BBC journalist for a long, trans woman. And she, wrote since the 50s. She was part of that first, she was the only reporter or journalist on Edmund Hillary's and Tenzing Norway's Everest summiting. I was like, okay, that might be good, but anyway, I kind of just veered away. And I knew that Florence Nightingale had written a great work on the Nile, and Freya Stark had written all about Asia Minor and things like that, but I hadn't really read any of them. And then obviously there is this long history of Italian travel writing. I don't know if you've picked any Italian travel writing, but like since Goethe's Italian travels, everyone's just gone there, and there's always these Eat, Pray, Loves and these Under the Tuscan Suns, and it's a bit overdone. And and everyone, even like, all the writing I could think of that I've read recently, good travel writing, Zadie Smith, Rachel Cusk, Jhumpa Lahiri, it's all Italian. And I was like, okay, it's a bit overdone. It's all like, I've gone to Italy and I'm going to write about it. And it's great because writing about Italy is it works. It very rarely fails.
Yeah, I love Italy.
Yeah, you almost can't do badly if you decide to go to Italy and write about it. But yeah, I don't know. It kind of just, because it seemed a bit overdone, and because one of my definite picks was there, I haven't picked any of them. But that leads into my first one, which is Twilight in Italy by D.H. Lawrence, which I've probably mentioned. I think in our first ever episode, I talked about.
Well, did we release that episode?
Yeah, no, this was Gateway Books, I think. It was my... No, this was opening.
We didn't release that episode.
Greatest openings. The opening to Sea and Sardinia.
The Phantom episode.
Yeah. No. The opening... Greatest opening, our first episode. I talked about Sea and Sardinia,
I remember
which is Lawrence's other travel book. And... which I think is actually a better travel book than Twilight in Italy. Twilight in Italy is more of a kind of... life criticism, philosophical text, where he kind of, yes, he travels on foot, treks from Austria through Switzerland and into northern Italy, and he lives in Italy for a time, and he even sees, speaking of Shakespeare, he sees an Italian performance of Hamlet, and he writes very funnily about what he sees and the Italian Hamlet, and how the Italians just couldn't quite get to grips with it in this little small northern town that he was on a lake. But he very much has this long philosophical treatise inside this book about North versus South, a very big Lawrence theme about the mechanical North and mechanical cold-bloodedness versus hot, sensual southern warm-bloodedness, and all these kind of geo-anthropomorphic ideas which he had. And this is a kind of why I'm so obsessed with it. I was actually kind of writing an essay until a few months ago, which I was going to try and get published, but I had to put it down because I had other things going on. But I'm now looking to pick back up again. So I thought, okay, this is an opportunity to think about it out loud on the pod, because
think away.
It's at this kind of midpoint, as he establishes, between north and south, there's this place called the Gotthard Pass in Switzerland. Very kind of sublime, high, great big rocks, mountainous pass, waterfall, surging river. Lawrence called it the navel of the world, the kind of dividing line, this point at which north becomes south or south becomes north when you pass through this place. And he fictionalizes it in Women in Love. In Women in Love, it kind of culminates at this place. And in Twilight in Italy, he also goes to this place. And for me, it's really important because in some of the research I'm doing, because Turner, the great English artist Turner, he painted the Pass of Gotthard many, many times. And it was kind of one of his most sublime and landscapes was set at this, trying to capture the sublimity, the beauty and the terror of this intimidating place. And then Ruskin, the great art critic, he also, who was kind of a devotee of Turner his whole life, he also went there and wrote very movingly about it. And of course, Lawrence never actually names them or talks about them in Twilight in Italy, but he more or less, in the same way that like Shakespeare takes from Montaigne or something, he like borrows so much from Ruskin and inserts all this art theory into his philosophy and into his travel as he goes through this part of this pass in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And so I loved all this big intersection of ideas. It kind of like blew my mind when I first read it. It was the first Lawrence I ever read, so it was kind of didn't really even get it, all of it at first, because Lawrence.
Were you traveling at the time?
No, I don't think I was. I think I came across it in Australia at a secondhand bookshop. A nice little leather-bound Twilight in Italy.
Oh, lovely.
I had heard of D.H. Lawrence, obviously a very famous name. Knew he was
a
great English writer. I didn't really know much about him. Knew he had something to do with sex and Lady Chatterley's lover or whatever. And so gave it a go. And the descriptions are, insanely good. Things which really struck me in terms of just at the level of description. I can remember him talking about describing olive trees as being smoky green or silver smoky green, which is, just that level of observation, or describing something as glossy as a bird's wing or something like that. And just being like, oh wow, he's really at the level of metaphor. He's got such a power, but
awareness.
Yeah, but then the more I read, and then I started to get really interested in art history and Turner and Ruskin and read all this stuff, and I was like, oh wow, all the connections and the big philosophical and art philosophy turning points being made at this point. In just this little piece of travel writing. And also, I brought up Proust. There's so much Proust in this. I kind of see Lawrence as the English Proust, the real writing of the subjective world. And this is published in 1916, a few years after Proust's first volume of Research, which was a literary hit at the time. And Lawrence spoke French. I assume he would have read it. And Proust was also a massive Ruskin nut. He even tried to translate one of Ruskin's works into French, even though he couldn't speak English. He would just do it. Proust would do it word for word with French and English dictionaries. He would translate word for word and create some kind of weird English-French typescript. Yeah. And because he knew Ruskin so well, and he felt affinity of him in terms of their philosophies of art and how they thought about image and its impact on emotion and memory and all these kind of things, that then he more or less just kind of paraphrased Ruskin into Proust and as a translation. And at the time, everyone kind of laughed at him for this translation, but now Ruskin scholars are like, actually, it's the best French translation there is. And so there's also heaps of Proust in this book. So it's just, as a travel book goes, it's kind of like Lawrence. It's always just this massive explosion of stuff. He's just going to throw everything at him that he feels inside and turn it into some grand philosophy. I don't even know. It's incredible. And that's why, I thought it was such a, amazing book when I first uncovered it, because it just inspires so much curiosity in me for so many different things. And so it's always with me in a way, because it's always, whenever I'm thinking, all the time now I'm reading Ruskin and Proust and all these kind of things, and it's always, it's from that starting point. It's a journey from that point of just randomly picking up Twilight in Italy all those years ago. Yeah. And so I'll just read a little bit so I don't go on too long. But it's so he's followed in the footsteps of Turner and Ruskin to this point, this grand place in the mountains, this pass, and of course he doesn't mention them, and he's transferring everything into his own Laurentian lexicon at this big collision point of dark and fearful, mechanical, unfeeling north and warm, bright, ancient south, but before he gets there, he's in Zurich. He's high above Zurich on a mountain pass, looking down on this, this kind of town and this very agricultural land, very segmented and cultivated, and objectively cold, and coldly objective rather. And he's and he says this: "I could not bear to look at it. It was so small and unreal. I had a feeling as if it were false, a large relief map. It seemed to intervene between me and some reality. I could not believe that this was the real world. It was a figment, a fabrication, like a dull landscape painted on a wall to hide the real landscape." And then as Lawrence, and so, the big Ruskin thing was, realism had taken hold of art. And when late Turner started to paint all these more abstract ideas, everything which was called proto-impressionism and led to real impressionism, where artists were like, yes, there's nature and there's reality, but there's also, I've got to link it with my feelings, with my subjective experience, and form this impression, which is, the biggest revolution in art. All kind of, started from Turner and Ruskin and all these ideas. And so Lawrence is doing the same thing. He's like, an old realist, what's called a naturalist painter, would have just, painted this scene of Zurich and the surrounds exactly, got all the fields in their exact proportion and the cows and all this kind of stuff, and thought it was beautiful nature. And he's like, fuck off, that's not nature. It doesn't inspire anything in me except for cold kind of hatred for the ugliness of what mankind does to natural landscapes. Yeah. And then so he moves on and he nears the pass. And then he begins to describe it in the way Turner painted it, in the way Ruskin described it. And he says, "It seemed to me as though some dramatic upheaval must take place. The mountains fall down into their own shadows. The valley beds were like deep graves. The sides of the mountains like the collapsing walls of a grave. The rush of time that continues throughout eternity, and one knows it all in one's blood. It is pure, sun-dried memory." And he's kind of... that's lovely. Engaging with this, kind of expressing this real difference in art and in one's experience to nature and one's experience to civilization. And so he's, engaging in this big, conflagration of ideas as he's kind of just hiking and making, really flippant comments of like, he sees English tourists and he's like, fucking... you suck, and he's like, he hates on everyone he sees, and he's throwing shade all over Germans, throwing shade on the Italians, hating everyone, and then making these big philosophical sweeps. But so that was kind of big explosion for me, and
that's I was just thinking, because my favorite pianist is this Italian dude who's still alive, Ludovico Einaudi. And he actually did a hike through the Alps, I think it was in 2019, and then wrote a 7-piece sort of piano piece to his experiences walking through the Alps. So it seems to be this thing that you were just saying, like Italy's overdone, but it seems to be a thing that artists sort of do as well. They walk through the Alps because it does seem to inspire, even though you were just saying he didn't find inspiration in probably the way he wanted. It obviously inspired something, and perhaps an inspiration of realizing he didn't like human civilization. As you said, he was cursing everyone and stuff. So that's very cool. That's very, very cool.
Oh, I'd like to hear that piano piece. But I mean, I think there's always something about... I mean, my second choice, I can. That's a good lead in, but so I'll try and remember that. But it just borders in general and frontiers and crossing from one type of ecology to another, or crossing a mountain or something. It's like they say that little like when you walk into a room and you're like, why did I come here? And the human brain is wired that when you switch from one space to another, if you've got spaces delineated in your mind in that way, if you've got borders like room to room, then your brain kind of wipes itself as it enters through one membrane into another one. It wipes itself and then reorganizes itself instantaneously. And so I think obviously writers and artists feed off that energy of that. You get a clean slate. You get to see something new, or you get to put something in a new perspective against an old one, and create a contrast there, which makes all the colors
bring your
and
own
everything
ideas
pop.
in.
Yeah. Anyway, great stuff. All right, what was yours second one?
Great stuff. My first one.
Oh yeah, of course.
Getting ahead of yourself, my goodness. My first one
traveling
was.
So fast.
This is one that I feel like you could have picked as well, and I don't know if you have, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. But Songlines by Bruce Chatwin.
Oh, I nearly picked Bruce Chatwin, but I haven't. But yeah,
okay, that's good.
Good.
But yeah, I was very worried that you might pick him. But this is. It's a book set in Australia, so it was sort of an easy pick for me for that reason. I don't think there's as much set in Australia as there should be, and I think this book does it quite well. Oh, well, I've got my issues with this book, but we can get to that. So Bruce Chatwin was a travel writer, and he comes down under, and so he wrote the Songlines, and it's a fictive non-fiction story where he just fills it with his own sort of elements and information, and it's this story based around the origin of Indigenous song and the songlines that are the songs that Indigenous people sing to understand the land and to create the land. And that's sort of one of the big ideas that he talks about, is that the Indigenous people didn't think the world existed unless they could sing it into creation. And so it's a very big idea, and I think he got chastised for it a fair bit because it was a bit too much to chew. But that aside, it is still a novel worth reading, and one that I particularly love because it's an incredibly personal story, but it's not personal about a particular person. It's more personal to the relationship to the land and the relationship that the Indigenous people have to the land. And so that's why I love it, for one reason. But another reason would be because it's set in Australia, but I think it glorifies a part of Australia that's often overlooked. I think when you say you're travelling to Australia, people just think beaches. Beaches is probably the main thing, and that's relatively fair enough. But this touches on some of the magical and rich history that we have underneath all the beauty that makes this country such a great place to travel to. So Bruce Chatwin, Songlines, I love this book, and I think he captures it quite well. I do have issues, but I'll let you jump in here because you might have an opinion first before I jump in, or I re-jump in with my issues.
I mean, yeah. I like this book too. It's a very influential book. I was going to pick as Bruce Chatwin, What Am I Doing Here? Which is kind of the first introduction I had to Bruce Chatwin, just a kind of collection of lots of travel writing, which I also really loved. But Songlines, I'm not sure what your issues are or what flack the book might have got in politically, but he was the person who kind of coined the term songlines, because as an explanation to explain this type of knowledge transfer that Indigenous Australians had and have. He described it as song, it wasn't literally singing, or at least as, maybe not all the time or everywhere, it's just it's a form of knowledge. It's a form of transfer of knowledge, how someone would get from one place to another, how someone would translate the stories from one place to another and give information as to where tools for survival were, tools for sacred worship, where all these kind of things,
water holes and trees that held not fruit but berries, and where they could find food and animals and plants and stuff.
And so to describe them as kind of songlines is just this wonderfully great metaphor or idea which Bruce Chatwin was able to give to this, what he had learned, what he saw to be, what people telling him this system of knowledge was. It's very hard for one system of knowledge, a Western, English writer, to understand a completely different conception of knowledge altogether, and to find a way to articulate and translate that. And he gave that idea, and I think a lot of maybe people were resistant of it, but I think there's been a worldwide exhibition, indigenous-led exhibition, where they talk more about this this system of knowledge which continues, and they've called it songlines, and they kind of as just a way to give not Western people or people from any other culture an idea of the kind of the manner of what this system is, because otherwise they're going to be like, what do you mean they deposit knowledge in one place and someone else comes and picks it up? Like, what do you mean by land? What do you mean by all these things? What do you mean by country? How is country different to land? All these very Australian indigenous philosophical definitions which they have, which are different from the English, different from everything else. And songlines is just, I guess, a good entry to that. So I think if anything, maybe there's complications, but he did at least provide this prism which other cultures can look at to understand or begin to understand indigenous philosophy and myth. Yeah.
Because the whole thing he was trying to do, well, I don't know if he's specifically trying to do it for this what we're talking about, but he addresses it, and they're trying to link up that the world is connected through song, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is sort of seen as the first sort of mythological story, was a song, and that they can all trace their foundations and inception to the one song kind of thing that was the very beginning, and that the Indigenous Australians have just continued this on in a different way that Western cultures have, whereas they then brought on the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then you had the Homeric Odyssey and Iliad and stuff like that. But my main issue with it was he just completely lets the whole story down in the last third, when he brings in his notebooks. If you can remember reading all those little, he'd have his little facts, and he'd have his pages of random facts that he just slotted into the story, and the story was so rich and fun and interesting, and then you just get like 30-page blocks of random facts that he'd picked up while traveling, and just felt the need to insert into this story, which detracted away from the story itself and became a bit frustrating to the end, because some of them were interesting facts, some of them were just simple ones like, oh, this culture calls milk this kind of thing, and it was all very basic stuff, and it just kind of got in the way of this great story. It felt like almost his publicist has said, you need to drag this story out a bit more, like it's a novella length now, and we need to make this a novel, so create some more. And he was just like, blah, here's some stuff. So that was my only issue.
I wonder, it could be a publisher's thing. I also vaguely remember something similar occurring in Patagonia, where it's amazing, and there's this big paleontological narrative which he runs through. Have you read the In Patagonia Chatwin book? No. So there's this whole Patagonia is like basically littered with dinosaurs. And there's a great history of paleontology, and people are finding stuff, and so he kind of tells the story of his journey through Patagonia, through paleontologists he meet and paleological discoveries and all this kind of stuff. And so really interesting. And then again towards the end, it kind of runs out of gas, and it kind of flitters into the stories fade away. It's not, this is the big thing about travel writing, and something which I might get to later, but if once the travel writing kind of departs from the writer actually traveling and experiencing the world to, and this is why I guess Twilight and Italy was so interesting, that he managed to weld it together so well, So you start, opinionating and philosophizing and analyzing and all this kind of stuff. All of a sudden you're like, actually, I want to go back to, you're feeling uncomfortable in the train, or your witty observations of these locals or these other tourists or whatever else. Suddenly you get taken out of the journey aspect and thrown into the, let's be serious for a moment. And you're like, chill out. Like, I don't know. Like, if I wanted to be serious, I would have read a serious history of this. You can give it to me in little shot form throughout. That's good. That keeps me going and it builds interest. But then if you kind of just cut the story aspect, because Songlines has this long story where he's going along, he's meeting, I can't remember who that Russian Australian guy he meets is, and he's traveling around and meeting people, and there's like a tractor he's looking for, and I can't remember all the different little narratives he has. But
he's got lots of little adventures basically. But
but then it kind of runs out of steam, and he gets into. But I guess it's I think people, it's one of those books as well which people know more than have read, and people know that it's a big thing. Like, I imagine probably a lot of tourists must read it if they come to Australia, or backpackers and things are like, it's the book you read when you come to Australia. And as far as books go, it's a pretty good one, I guess, for that reason. Have you watched I haven't been able to see it. There's a Werner Herzog film called In the Footsteps of Bruce Chatwin.
Oh, no, I haven't actually. Wait, that came out last year?
A few years ago. I can't remember when. I mean, Herzog and Chatwin were good friends in What Am I Doing Here? There's Chatwin has multiple stories about being on Herzog film sets and getting up to all sorts of adventures and things, but I haven't been able to see this film, and I really want to. I can't find it online. It was on Mubi, if anyone. It's like, Mubi's like an indie kind of film Netflix thing, but they only have certain films on it at any one time, and it was on for a period, and I didn't catch it, so I'm like, But I love Werner Herzog because he's just his films are so funny. It's always just comes on and he's like, the volcano is the fieriest pit in the world. For like 2 hours. Anyway, Songlines. All right, lovely. Well, on to... There's no strong
second
link.
pick.
Yeah, onto my second link, which is... well, it's a little bit of a cheat because it's kind of 2 in 1. Whoa. It's... the book is Travels with Herodotus by Ryszard Kapuściński. Do you know this book?
No, but I had a feeling you'd be picking Herodotus.
Well, I wanted to pick Herodotus because Herodotus, I mean, he's called the father of history, but he's really the father of travel writing and father of journalism and reporting, because he just kind of goes around and talks to people and then tells you what they say, and people have called it history. He never called it history. He was just like, he always qualified every statement. Herodotus, he was like, these people said this, is it true? I don't know, but they told me that. He's like, apparently this guy said to Xerxes, he's like, you a bitch, and then apparently, like, he's just the greatest gossip of ancient history,
just a huge gossip.
And he traveled everywhere. He tried to find the source of the Nile. He went far into Asia. He went everywhere. And so it's a bit of a cheat, because not only do you get Kapuściński, who was a great Polish journalist and was a foreign correspondent all over the world for Polish and global news agencies, and has lots of his own travel stories. But he, and this book is kind of him, when I think in the 50s, he got his first assignment, he got sent to India, and he's like, I don't know anything about India. I don't even speak English or whatever the Indian languages are. I have no idea. And his editor was just like, oh, you'll work it out. And then just gave him Herodotus because Herodotus it had long been censored by the Soviet censors, but had just been had its first translation into Polish like a few years before. And so he doesn't even know what it is. And he's like, just read this. And he gets sent to India. He doesn't know what's going on. And so that's where this book kind of starts. And then he kind of reads Herodotus over about like a 50-year period, where he kind of goes back and forth relating different historical, he's at he's in Egypt when there's a coup. He's in he goes to Maoist China. He goes to India. He goes to all these places, and you're in there. He's a great writer himself, talking about his own travels. And then for long periods, he'll either just paraphrase or talk about Herodotus and what Herodotus was up to and why Herodotus is amazing and how fascinated he is by this man's curiosity and how astounding this person's curiosity is, and how singular, these kind of figures come around like once in a millennia. Yeah. And it's great. So you get little snapshots of Herodotus, who, as I've discussed in this podcast, was kind of my first love. I just got given, I don't know, like a year 8 ancient history class, and that you have to go buy this fat book of Herodotus, and read about Peloponnesian Wars, which are a small bit of Herodotus, but then you just get this guy just telling stories all the time, and they're mad. There's no judgment. It's just like, and then they killed all the women. Next chapter. You're like, wait, what? All the Babylonian men had to kill all the women, and no one said anything about this. They just did it. And he was like, fucking Darius told them to, so that's the shit. And so really, that was. But you just get so many stories, and you just get this beginning of journalism and reportage, and so I loved it. And I love this book. And so I'll just give you a bit of a taste. And so here he is talking about Herodotus and how such people are really rare. There aren't many such enthusiasts born. The average person is not especially curious about the world. He is alive, and being somehow obliged to deal with this condition, feels the less effort it requires, the better. Whereas learning about the world is labour, and a great all-consuming one at that. Most people develop quite antithetical talents. In fact, to look without seeing, to listen without hearing, and mainly to preserve oneself within oneself. And then obviously Herodotus is the exact opposite, he's saying, for that.
Yeah.
And then he has this great everything of substance casts a shadow, and so he's always talking about that people like Herodotus, this amazing historical figure which we don't know much about apart from that he traveled his whole life, and then when he was really old just decided to sit down and write a book about it. And that we have that book today, and that's gives us most of what we know about like thousands of years.
Basically everything until like Cicero came along, basically. And
there was Xenophon and people like that, but Herodotus did a lot of that work of and it's all just going to talking to people. And so there's this great, which we've talked about before, where Kapuściński's talking about history, the art of history, and how, really history as we know it today is a very modern thing. And that basically for most of history, it's just talking to people, and Herodotus knew and talks about memory is a very fleeting thing, and it's vulnerable, and people change it almost immediately, and the longer it goes, the more it changes, and it changes for certain reasons of the human condition and how people are dealing with things, all this kind of stuff. And so, the history we have is, did it happen? Probably not at all the way we think it did, but
no,
there's something in the way we have been told that we preserve because we need it preserved in such a way. But he also talks about, why he's so interested in this figure, this amazing, who was this guy, and why did he travel so much, and why was he so curious, and why did he not judge people, and why did he, when he got to all these places, Kapuściński knows as a foreign correspondent and journalist, to make people trust you, to make you tell people their stories, you have to have a very charming and kind of observant personality, a very rare personality.
That's something I'm just remembering now that they said about Bruce Chatwin, is that he'd often go in and he wasn't as charming as he thought he was, and he'd sort of just be demanding this information and be getting very surface level information about songlines and this rich history, and then he sort of like came in a whirlwind and then just like left left with a trail of dust behind him. And so, yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but yes.
No, I think that's interesting as well, because that must be, part of it is, one of these personalities is, that's what Kapuściński gets on to. Yes, they're incredibly vibrant and curious and all these things, but they also must be very lonely. That's the shadow that their kind of curiosity casts. Why do they keep traveling? Why can't they stop traveling? We talked about this with Invisible Cities in our Literary Cities episode, that Marco Polo kind of has to keep traveling because he can't go back, because the place he left, which he remembers, is not the same place. He's not the same person. Time has changed everything and nothing. This is a French saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Yeah. But there is, if someone's going to be like, these are the only people who have the power of curiosity to record world events, and yet they're so curious they have to keep moving. So really all we have about anything is surface and superficial. And the best we can hope of someone to do the work of translation for cultures, from indigenous to non-indigenous in the Bruce Chatwin case, is just someone like Chatwin, who is going to come in like a whirlwind. Lawrence came to Australia in a whirlwind. He wrote Kangaroo in 2 months, and it's still the best book about the Australian psyche that's ever been published. And he was here for 2 months. He was there for 2 months. So, people do come in a whirlwind, I guess. And sometimes the most incisive stuff can happen in a whirlwind, but it's also superficial. And this will be, one last quote about... Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say I love the histories, Herodotus's histories. We had to study them at uni, and it's a book that I've definitely got on my list to go back, because it's a book that you can read as a historian and just detract the historical fact from it, but it's also a book you can read as just a leisure and enjoy the stories as well. And I remember reading it thinking I'm not enjoying it as much because I'm studying it and therefore trying to pull out fact from fiction, and there's, from a historical perspective in the modern day, you assume a bit more fiction than fact in it, and so you don't enjoy it as much. So it's definitely a book that I can't wait to go back and just enjoy the stories that he has to tell. Yeah,
me too. I mean, I read this book. A roommate at the place I lived before my current apartment, he had a lot of Polish and Eastern European writing and stuff, and he was like, "You've got to read this Kapuściński guy." And so I read this, and it was just like, I fucking love this guy. And I've since read other books. He wrote books about everything. Long career. And he's kind of known as, I think he won like Polish Journalist of the Century or something like that. He was he was recognized as being a great writer in his day. Yeah. And he died a couple of decades ago maybe. But he has, I don't know, I think I was lucky to have Herodotus maybe given to me in high school when I was quite young, and that I didn't have historical method or any kind of, I was learning
professors beating upon me.
Yeah, I was learning about primary sources and all those kind of things like you do in a history class, but it was more like I just got forced to read this book as I got forced to read lots of other books. Not forced to read many other books. That was the problem with my education. There's only a few books I got forced to read. Most of them were trash. But Herodotus, you're like, holy shit, what the fuck is this? And it's so far gone. It's so ancient in our conception of ancient that it just feels like you're just opening a little window into a fantasy. It doesn't feel historical because it's so distant. You're like, who are these Spartans? Who are these? Who the fuck is Cyrus? What is going on? Like,
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, this just I thought a great quote about traveling and about that Kapuściński writes about Herodotus. Such people, while useful, even agreeable to others, are, if truth be told, frequently unhappy, lonely, in fact. Yes, they seek out others, and it may even seem to them that in a certain country or city they have managed to find true kinship and fellowship, having come to know and learn about a people. But they wake up one day and suddenly feel that nothing actually binds them to these people, that they can leave here at once. They realize that another country, some other people, have now beguiled them, and that yesterday's most riveting event now pales it now pales and loses all meaning and significance. For all intents and purposes, they do not grow attached to anything, do not put down deep roots. Their empathy is sincere but superficial. If asked which of the countries they have visited they like best, they're embarrassed. They do not know how to answer. Which one? In a certain sense, all of them. There is something compelling about each. To which country would they like to return once more? Again, embarrassment. They had never asked themselves such a question. The one certainty is that they would like to be back on the road, going somewhere. To be on their way again. That is the dream. And
that's a very honest quote.
Yeah, very honest. Obviously because he's speaking about himself and maybe his life and that he just got kind of thrown into, and then for 50 years he's a great forest correspondent and never really gets to return to Poland for that long. Which is probably a good thing because it was under Soviet power, but you know what I mean? I love that view of Herodotus because, you kind of had this idea of this, old, very learned guy writing these things and it's fact, but maybe it's not fact. And you haven't really learnt the difference. But I love the idea that he was just a kind of traveler, a guy going around, and he was probably lonely in places. And, he maybe, what trauma drove him away? What drove him to travel? Maybe what did he lose? Yeah. What happened to him that he was so desperate to run from place to place? Something I really know about. And, it was very telling to me when I read that book. I was like, wow, maybe that's why Herodotus struck me so hard when I first read him. And what kind of path did I get led down just because someone gave me Herodotus at the age of 14, whatever it was. Yeah. And that some guy some lonely dude from 400 BC like kind of got into my head and was like, I know what this is like. Yeah. And not even the history, his personality is what gets to you. And that's I guess what I enjoyed so much about it. There was something in how he conveyed, how he talked about things where you did get a little sense that he was a bit rootless, he was wondering, he was a bit lost. And I really liked that. So Travels with Herodotus. Kapuściński.
Brilliant pick. And I'm sure we'll probably do an episode on Herodotus one day anyway. So
love to. I mean, that means we can both go back and read sections. I mean, it's massive.
Yeah, it's huge.
Like you said, I'd love to go back and read it.
500-600 pages. So yeah, but I'd happily read the whole thing. So look forward to that episode.
All right. What's your number 2?
Very loose segue in that it's also a historical piece of fiction. I was thinking Herodotus, but I had a very sneaky suspicion that you would pick it. So instead, I went for The Odyssey by Homer.
Yeah.
So I thought of this one because Songlines came to me very naturally as a travel book, and then obviously going back and thinking about the origins of indigenous song and how that possibly relates to the Epic of Gilgamesh and all these other epics and stuff, it sort of naturally drove me to the Odyssey, and here we are.
The Odyssey.
So this is the second part of Homer's major works, the first, of course, being the Iliad, and I have not spoken about the Iliad in this podcast because that was in episode 0. So this one is the journey of Odysseus home. It takes 10 years, and he's traveling, not the whole time, but it is very much a travel story for me. A great adventure story. I mean, I prefer the Iliad because I think the Iliad's a perfect story of everything, but this is a very, very close second. It's this great adventure story of cunning and wit. There's little parables in it. There's stuff that warns you off doing stuff. Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, and he's trying to get home from the Battle of Troy, which lasted 10 years, and he pisses off the wrong people, and his journey home ends up taking 10 years, even though, of course, it geographically from where Troy was in Turkey to Greece should take, modern standards, probably a few hours by boat. But it somehow took him 10 bloody years. And I love it because it's it's a cautionary tale at times. He gets stuck with the Cyclops, and he's very intelligent, and he says, "My name's Nobody," and then he attacks and blinds the Cyclops, and the Cyclops calls out, "Nobody blinded me, nobody attacked me," and so nobody comes to the aid of the Cyclops, and he gets free, and it's this wonderful moment of outwitting a Cyclops and protecting all his men. But at the last moment, he basically calls out, "You just got punked by Odysseus, king of Ithaca." And the Cyclops says, "Well, cheers, thanks for your name. I'm now going to ruin your life," because he contacts his father Poseidon, who's the god of the sea, and of course they're traveling by boat by sea, and ruins his entire journey. And that's why it takes 10 years. So I love this story, a great adventure story. I love an adventure story. It's got a bit of everything in it, just like the Iliad. Yeah. Have you read this?
Oh yeah, I love this book. This is such a great choice as well for travel writing, and it's the quintessential original, The Journey, and
because then it went on to inspire the Roman myth for how they were founded is copied straight off this. The Aeneid is just this story retold, but with a Roman name.
And it's been retold forever, and it was probably a retelling in the first place, like the Gilgamesh, and Indigenous Australians know everything. I think I was talking about in a previous episode on about the Goldberg variations. Everything's just a variation of a theme. There was some original melody, I guess. In
nothing new under
nature.
The sun.
No, and we're just toying with the same inner condition and toying with it. And of course, the inner condition is that we are wandering about, islands of consciousness in the stream of time, and
just
we're
trying to
on a
make
dying
sense of it
rock
all,
falling through space, and we're just, and so the journey is, of course, a natural emanation from that condition, and the feeling of being lost, and the feeling of growing up and encountering challenges, and how we symbolize and metaphors, the metaphors of those events. I mean, it's so good. From the Cyclops to Circe to the Phoenicians to Scylla and Charybdis, and running the needle.
Sirens.
The sirens, of course. The sirens are amazing, and you can see David's amazing paintings, and this guy puts the wax in his ears
and then gets
all
tied
the sailors
to the mast
and ties to the mask. Brilliant.
Begging to be set free. Yeah.
And temptation, and there's so many glorious things, and then of course he gets back, and what I also like about I've there's all the other modern retellings, from Ulysses to Omeros and Walcott and Joyce and whatever else, but it is such a masterfully told tale. As you've talked about with the Iliad and other things, it's got all those verbal characteristics of the repetition, which a storyteller would have used. The sea is always wine dark, or whatever it is. But I think what I also love about this is 10 years, and he's wandering, he's lost, he's getting up to all these other adventures and stuff. But a bit like life, I think, when you're away from your homeland, or you're in exile or something, there's always Ithaca on the horizon. It's always kind of just there. You can almost touch it. It's always hovering in the back of your mind. It's always a part of you, because you can never quite dispense with it, no matter how hard you may want to, or if you don't want to. Baldwin said you cannot deny your origins. You can't get rid of it. It's this, your earliest memories are your most potent. And he tries to get back there. And, you also have the story of Telemachus and Penelope, and so many stories have spun out of those as well. And just amazing.
I think that Ithaca on the horizon is just a great point, because he gets so close. After he's left the Cyclops, they can see Ithaca on the horizon, and that's when Poseidon stirs up this storm and steers him away from Ithaca, and so for 10 years he's got the knowledge of, I could see my homeland, and now I'm just so far from it. And 6 years into this journey of trying to get home, you could just think, oh, fuck this. I'm just going to forsake my homeland. I've been away from home now for 16 years, 10 at war, 6 trying to get back to home, and I could just forsake it all. But he continues. I mean, he has a relationship with a god or a demigod, and he could live there happily, but he forsakes it all to try to get back home to his wife and son. And spoiler, he gets there.
Penelope's faithful of 16 years. It reminds me that in Castaway, Helen Hunt remarries after 3 years. The fuck is that about? If I was Tom Hanks, I would be pissed. He comes back and the guy's like, I'm actually your wife's husband. You've been gone for 4 years or whatever. Yeah. I'd be like, bitch, 4 years? Like, 4 years, serious?
Not that long.
That's not that long. I could have been alive. I mean, yeah, it was a FedEx plane crash, but 16 years and you still waited? I mean, I guess she had no choice. Her whole claim to the Ithaca and the whole life was based upon Odysseus, so she needed to keep it. But still, gotta commend Penelope.
Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah. But also maybe Odysseus was staying away on purpose. He's like, oh no, there's a terrible wind. Oh no,
it's blowing us off course. Let's go check out the sirens.
Let's go to the sirens. Let's go back to that hot demigod I was.
Oh, how good. Alrighty, your third pick.
Okay, well, I was tossing and turning, lots of great travel books I was thinking about picking that I really loved, but I thought I'd go something completely different. I was considering, Twain wrote travel writing, Steinbeck wrote travel writing, everyone, Orwell's great book, but I was like, something totally different. Well,
this is what I was thinking of when I was picking them, is that the last two topics we've done previously, literary cities and whatever we did last week, fresh in my mind, of course, memoirs. Both, I mean, I did A Year in Provence, which is an English couple traveling to France, and it's a loose city, but they're all stories that could have been picked for today as well. Like, I feel like the last 3 weeks have been very interchangeable.
Yeah, I think, there's a smooth transition, I guess, between each, which is nice. And as we're talking, I was like, oh yeah, actually we talked about that. So there's a little natural link there. So maybe, I mean, we're admitting now that we don't prepare these things, but we can cut this out and people won't know.
They'll never know.
Wow, these guys are they're
on top of it. They really picked up their game this year.
Really, there's a lot of lattice work going on here, really tying things up.
Yeah.
But I can't really think of a good link to the one I'm thinking about. But what I decided to go with was a massive book in my life, as it turns out, but is not generally thought of as a travel book. But in reality it is, which is Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Oh. Do you know about this book? This is the kind
I've heard of the author, but not the book.
It's the kind of foundational text of American studies. It's a kind of work of political philosophy. And so, I first encountered it in my undergraduate, kind of got 2 degrees in American politics and literature. So this is the Bible, basically, of American studies. Alexis de Tocqueville was a 19th century French aristocrat, political philosopher, historian. And he got sent with another guy called Beaumont to 1830s America to basically investigate the American prison system and come back to France and, relay any learnings that could be given to the French penitentiary system.
Yep.
What happened, they did end up going back to France. They spent about 9 months in the US, traveling around in a wagon. everywhere. They went to Canada for a bit. They went all over the South. They went to New York. They went all over the place. And they did submit, a kind of academic work on Americans' penitentiary system. And then Beaumont wrote a book about slavery in America, and de Tocqueville wrote a 2-volume book called Democracy in America, which is still probably the best book on American democracy and one of the great books of political philosophy of the 19th century, where he kind of goes around small chapters, relatively small, where he kind of looks at lots of different issues, but he kind of goes over everything from the pervasiveness of religion to slavery to money to liberty to how democracy happens to how voting happens to how prisons work to how people interact with each other to everything. I mean, he's like Herodotus, just a voracious curiosity for everything, and talks to everyone, and then writes this book. And it's he relates it to, he is a nobleman. His great grandfather, I think, got his head cut off by the guillotine in the Revolution, and then when the Bourbon Restoration happened in the kind of early 19th century, his family kind of got their nobility back, but he knew that nobility was a thing and aristocracy was coming to an end. He knew democracy was coming, and it happened in America, and let's see what's going on. But he was also very aware that democracy had these huge kind of born-in poisons, this slavery and the prisons and all these kind of things. And so he wasn't, walking up and being like, oh, wow, look at this place that Jefferson and Franklin have just kind of thought up. He wasn't blinded. He really looked closely. Yeah. And he, very much in the frame of Montesquieu and Machiavelli and, Plato, had a very philosophical analysis of everyday life in America and how democracy was working. And just an amazing book, but also, he's just cruising around on a wagon.
Yeah, that's so cool.
And
I love that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll get a few quotes just to kind of give you a taste of Tocqueville.
Because it's a great segue into my third and final pick, but that's what travel does, is it ultimately opens you up to the experiences of the place and make you question them and relate them back to what you know, which is, of course, your homeland.
Yeah. I mean, it introduces this play of opposites. And, that's the only way you can find balance, by having these two things. And I think that's where progress comes from, of ideas, of societies and things like that, through this play of opposites. And he really has this open mind, and he has a noble character, but he also is in this country which has rejected royalty, rejected nobility of that way, and yet repurposed it and glorified money and a form of Protestantism and other things. They've more or less just substituted institutions for other ones. And so he's seeing all these things. He's seeing young, unified colonies of America from the perspective of, a continental European. But anyway, so he says things like, the spell of royalty is broken, but it has not been succeeded by the majesty of laws. So he even has a bit of sassiness. He's still like, Americans are crazy. And they are still crazy in a way. And here he is talking about slavery. The colony was scarcely established when slavery was introduced. This was the capital fact, which was to exercise an immense influence on the character, the laws, and the whole future of the South. Slavery, and this is he's writing this in the 1830s, 30 years before the Civil War. Slavery, as I shall afterwards show, dishonors labor. It introduces idleness into society, and with idleness, ignorance and pride, luxury and distress, it enervates the powers of the mind and benumbs the activity of man. The influence of slavery, united to the English character, explains the manners and the social condition of the southern states. So, very scathing on the kind of what's happened to white southernness through the presence of slavery. And in other sections, he's obviously read Adam Smith. He's obviously read, economic texts which show that not only does slavery dishonor labor for the master, but it's actually no good for a society. He's very critical. And he says, one last quote, he says, "Now, I only know of two methods of establishing equality in the political world. Rights must be given to every citizen or none at all."
Yeah. But then if you get none, what have you got? Communism.
Yeah. Well, anarchy, I guess. That you get
anarchy,
Hobbes' state of nature, which is equality. Yeah. I mean, everyone's equally,
free to be crazy.
Free to die. It's brutish and short. But yeah, I mean, huge book. I used it through all of my degrees. So both of my degrees, really. You can find something to Tocqueville for everything. All the time, I'm like, oh, what, where can I go to substantiate this opinion? Let me just go to my notes on to Tocqueville. Oh, thank you. Got it. Yeah. Quote. This is the exact quote I'll be wanting. I'll be like, yep, yoink, boom, put it in there. Thank you. So yeah, to Tocqueville. And, it is also just, like you said, really demonstrates why, travel can produce real originality and fecundity of ideas.
Yeah, which is a great segue into my third and final pick, which was a novella called Sinbad by Kurt Vonnegut.
Okay.
Have you read this?
I have not read this. I mean, I know Sinbad. I mean, I know Sinbad as a kind of, there's a historical Sinbad and there's a cartoon Sinbad, but I don't think I've read this book.
To this, it was a very, very late call up. I had another book ready to go and I was drawing up the notes on it, and I finished reading this book this week, and it just sort of slotted in really perfectly that I had to put it in. It's also on Audible and it's also free. It's only like an hour and a half, so I would recommend. But it's this wonderfully short, sort of deep philosophical exploration that raises questions of travel and what you get out of it. It's a bit paradoxical in that it sort of resolves itself in turning you away from traveling, but it also explores that idea of what you get out of traveling. So it's about a 20-year-old man-ish, 20-ish-year-old man who leaves to go traveling against the wishes of his parents, and he gets washed up on this island, and there's 6 people on the island: Mr. A, B, and C, and then Miss D, E, and F. And then over time, he's got all these questions. He doesn't remember how he got there, and they just sort of go about their days and do their work. And he starts having all these curious kind of questions arise, and as the story goes on, they unfold and you begin to understand. So I've got one quote. It's the opening, and it's a bit long. It's about a paragraph long, but I think it kind of sets you up for what the story is ultimately trying to explore. So I'll read it, then we'll go from there. I had an uncle who left his hometown and his family business there to become a fine actor. His talent was a minor one, but a pretty one. It lasted for 15 years and was gone. He came home with the ashes of it and died 20 years later, poor and, as it happened, drunk. When I decided to leave home, my family told me not to and singled out my uncle, who was then still alive, as an example of what became of wanderers. The most telling part of the argument was that my uncle considered himself a failure because he was not dying fat, rich and sober like his brothers who had stayed home in the snug business structure my grandfather had built. Even though my uncle had shown more brilliance and courage in his prime, he was still a failure because of the way his life was ending. All's bad that ends badly, and it's only the sick-minded who can feed on the past. And so that's the opening paragraph to the story, and it draws you in very quickly.
Yeah.
I'd say my two issues with it are it resolves itself in he ultimately comes to the conclusion that you shouldn't travel, which I don't think is good, and it's too short. It's a great idea. He gets to these questions. He gets to this island, and he ends up asking all these questions. They go to bed at 8 p.m. and their food just sort of materializes, and he's got these questions, and of course they're all questions that you transfer to your own life of why do I work 5 days a week? Who created this? And it's something we spoke about last week when you were talking about the calendars, like who's implemented all these things into our lives that we just sort of routinely follow without questioning. And that's what the story is exploring. So it's a perfect little travel story. It captures the brilliance of travel and what it can reveal to you when you go into different cultures. And very unknown, this story. There's very little of it online. There's no Wikipedia page. There's nothing about it. Impossible to find. Couldn't find it on Z Library. So yeah, I would recommend it.
Wow, Sinbad. Well, yeah, I don't think I've heard of a Vonnegut story called Sinbad. So this is a great find. And it sounds very interesting. I love that opening because I'm always thinking about and we did talk about this in Literary Cities, that this person was courageous and they didn't have this life where food just materializes, obviously because they have money through their, they have this stable, rich suburban kind of, I don't know, nobility set up where they just, I think that's a good a line from de Tocqueville or something, which is like the only freedom or equality we'll ever find is once we how does it go? Oh yeah, when the legislator has once regulated that the law of inheritance, he may rest from his labor. And yeah, but then so those brothers in that opening paragraph, they got to have an easy life, but they, just because this guy's life didn't end amazingly, should someone be, you can live your whole life amazingly and then fall off a train platform, and it's like, well, that's not a very good way to go, and so we'll just say your whole life was a waste. But yeah, I guess it's interesting to find out why Vonnegut in this book does say that travel doesn't broaden the mind. I mean, maybe because the first time he was forced to leave Indianapolis, he was sent to Dresden in World War II. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't enjoy that either.
Yeah. No, that whole city was just leveled.
Yeah, and he's watching giraffes melt and stuff. I mean, it's not, that's not exactly the good way to travel, Kurt. And
no, it's a quirky story. You don't really know what's going on most of the story because it is so sort of weird and wacky, but it does all make sense in the end, and it's very Kurt Vonnegut, and it's a good bit of fun.
All right, well, that's going to be on my listening account this week. Very nice. I need something.
Speaking
after Dr.
of
Jekyll
which,
and Mr. Hyde. Yeah, speaking of, what are you going to read this week? Oh no.
Well, I just finished reading another book, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James.
Wow.
Have you read this?
Yeah, I love Henry James. I don't like scary stories. It's not too scary, apart from there being a very creepy kid, but it's an amazing story.
Okay, I didn't really like it.
Good, yeah. I mean, it's incredible for what it is.
For the time.
In terms of narrative, and in terms of what it did for modern narrative, but yeah, I mean, I don't really like ghost stories and this kind of thing, so it's kind of creepy.
To me, it was just a bit surface level, and obviously it's historically dated now. He wrote it in whatever 1845 or whenever it was, so there's not much to compete against in regards to to that, but yeah, it was just a bit too surface level for me that I wasn't scared. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not.
Maybe Dracula's ruined me to a level of language I'm expecting now for all horror stories.
Right. I don't think he's trying to scare as much as, I don't know, talk about ghosts among us in a kind of more literal way. But I mean, it's creepy. I didn't like the creepiness of it.
It's odd. Like, it's unnerving. You don't know what's going on. And you're like, well, where are these faces? Why can she only see them? What's going on?
Yeah. And who who's paying her? What is this job that she's got? And then who is that, these ghosts.
But I think that's sort of the thing I didn't like is she'd have these episodes of seeing the faces. And that was sort of it. And then she's like, it's like, and a week passed and nothing happened. And it's like, if I saw a face in a window, I'd be freaking out 24/7.
Yeah.
But she's like, and a week went past and we continued on with our sensibilities of education and teaching the kids and nothing was wrong. And I was like, no, you just saw a ghost. Like, freak out a bit, please.
But, people who say they see ghosts, a lot of them are so, I don't know, calm about it. I mean, obviously when they say it, you just cast them off as being like, okay, no, you haven't. But, your mind is playing tricks on you. It happens to everyone in different ways, and it's just happening to you in this way. But, I don't know. If I saw an apparition or something, or even a reflection of a face in a dark window, I would bolt. I don't care if I was looking after kids. I would kick those kids over and leg it. Especially kids as creepy
sacrifice.
It's a kid called Miles or something. Like, hella... Yeah, no time for that kid.
Way too sophisticated for like a 6-year-old. He's having like full conversations and
yeah, that's also creepy. Yeah, like you can't be smarter than me now when you're 6. But yeah, I don't know. As far as Henry James go, not my favorite book. But yeah, no, but interesting. I mean, again with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, wasn't that scary or there was, I guess. Maybe it was released as a serial originally. I'm not sure. And
it was.
People, were a bit surprised by the reveal. But I guess because it's so known in the language now that it was kind of just like, okay, get to the reveal so I know how this story works because it's a short story and Stevenson's a good writer. But yeah, it didn't really work on me other than that at any level.
Yeah.
So yeah. But then this week I was thinking about, what other travel books have I always wanted to read and then not, and maybe could I look at some of those? And I'm not sure if I mentioned at the top, but the one I jumped into and I was, nearly tried to smash through so that I could talk about it this week is Black Lamb, Grey Falcon by Rebecca West, which is her kind of great history of Yugoslavia and traveling and things. It's like 2,000 pages, so I didn't
just
get
smash through that in a week.
Exactly. So maybe you save it for another episode, but it's amazing. I was really like, I've always resisted it, perhaps because I'm like Yugoslavian ancestry and not really interested, but
or it's 2,000 pages long.
Yeah, I mean a bit, but she's very good. It's fucking great. I mean, and it's also travel writing in the sense that you get none of that travel. As we're talking about a bit with Chatwin and stuff. As soon as it leaves the travel, or also as soon as it becomes like we've traveled, as soon as it becomes more of an itinerary than travel writing. Like, we journeyed through the night and arrived as the dawn came and whatever. As soon as we traveled through the night and then the dawn came and we had breakfast, and then it's like, okay, now you just, if you're traveling and you want to talk about, I was uncomfortable and there was some weird guy sitting next to me.
You don't want to just list stuff. Yeah.
You want descriptions of people on the train. You don't want to miss. That's a good thing about like Sea and Sardinia. The best bits is when he's actually traveling to Sardinia, or the first opening gambit of Black Lamb, Grey Falcon that I read. She's on the train through Germany and she's she's stealing a first class seat from someone and her husband's relating all this history of the area, and there's some other guy comes back who's there's different character descriptions that automatically you've got a whole kind of Orient Express thing going on, and it's just a chapter in a travel writing book, and you've got a cast of characters, and it's vibrant. And so yeah, that's what I've been reading this week. And I guess like there's that old adage, you don't know someone until you've traveled with them. And and sometimes there's a great travel writing is good because there's some great historical event that it covers, or you're in Italy, so you've got all this food and architecture to talk about. But when if a writer can entertain you just in the tedium of the actual travel as well as the events that happen, you're like, oh yeah, that's the good stuff.
Yeah, they're a good writer then. Yeah. Brilliant. Look forward to hearing more about it.
Yeah, hopefully. Well, I'll see how I go on the old 1,000 pages, but but it is good so far. Yeah, Rebecca West, but who is also the wife of H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds and Time Machine and stuff. And
the Time Machine.
She was a kind of
another travel book, I guess.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, though. Anyway.
It is a weird one.
Yeah, but yeah. Anyway, that was another episode of On the Same Page. I feel like we're on the same page for a lot of that.
Yeah, it was a good app.
Yeah, lovely app. As always, let us know your thoughts, email, or check us out on Instagram, whatever's going on.
Yeah.
We're all over the place. Give us a listen. Tell your friends. If you don't have any friends, you've got us. So
we're there for you.
We'll be there for you, just not in person because we like to be alone and read.
Don't actually see us in person,
Anyway, and COVID. So, what else?
Blame COVID.
But all right, guys. Toodles.
Catch up.